sermon series, but this morning I thought this kind of fit well with the communion message. You go to the various palaces that Queen Elizabeth owns in England. You want to know which one she's at the time. Do you know how you can tell? It's that her flag is flying on top of the castle. Do you know how you know the king is residing in the heart of a Christian? It's the flag of joy. Jesus Christ is at work. And I stole that. C.S. Lewis was the one who initially came up with that illustration, and I think he's bang on right. God works in our lives, and it takes us somewhere. God acts, and because God acts in our lives, there are certain reactions that come out of our hearts. And we've been talking about that in this section of Mark, because kind of from the end of chapter 1 through partway through chapter 3, Jesus does a number of things that helps us to understand His kingdom. And we've been putting up the major themes on the wall over here. It started with compassion. And I'm going to put some illustrations on the screen behind me because I'm hoping everybody's going to be able to follow my kind of way of thinking. I kind of had a picture in my head, and sometimes it's hard to explain diagrams and pictures in your head. But God starts with a certain action in our lives, and that is compassion. And because God acts in compassion, and God cares about where we're at, we have a reaction. Everything we have with God, every good thing starts with God. And we just react to what God is doing. And when we react to compassion, we find faith. Faith starts to grow in our lives. We put our trust in Jesus. Because we have faith, God is able to act more. And that's the second two things that are on the wall over there. There are two things that come out of faith. Forgiveness and God giving us second chances. And each of those has a slightly different reaction that comes out of our lives. Forgiveness brings us, I've got the word glorified, to worship, to praise, to honor God. And the fact that God gives us second chances when we don't deserve it leads us to share second chances with others. That I am willing to care for other people. Nels came up and talked about giving out these bags. Do you think the homeless in Edmonton deserve us driving out and giving these? Doesn't matter whether they deserve it or not. We have a God of second chances. We give second chances, maybe well beyond second chances. Because we've been given that. Because of this forgiveness, because of these second chances, we worship God and we share that love with others. That leads to God being able to act in our lives in another way, and that's bringing out joy. Joy is something that God can draw out of us because of that worship, because we're caring for other people. Because God brings out joy, that leads to us being focused on Jesus Christ, not on this world. Let me explain that. I've got on the back of the bulletin our outline, and the outline is going to be the same pretty much throughout this section of Mark. God's action, our reaction, then something a little more specific, my reaction. And we're going to do this rather quickly today because I know I only got about 10 minutes, then we've got to move into communion. But that's okay. I think we can do this. The Old Testament describes a very special day that the Jewish people had to follow. It was called the Day of Atonement. In Hebrew it's called Yom Kippur. You've got a calendar that has Jewish holidays on it. It comes in the fall every year. It was a day of fasting. As the Jewish people progressed as a nation, they decided they needed to fast more than one day a year. And the really good Jewish people started to fast twice a week. That's a lot more than once a year. They started fasting 2 times a week. And all the good Pharisees, all the good religious leaders, even all the good followers of John the Baptist would twice a week take time where from sunrise to sunset, they set aside food. Now they would eat early in the morning. They get up early. They would eat dinner after the sun went down. But for that 12-hour span, approximately, keep in mind they're close to the equator, about 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., they would put aside food. And they would do some things to go with it. You see, there were 2 reasons why they fasted. The first was because it was a symbol of the fact that they mourned the sins that they had done that had grieved God. They were mourning for the things that both individually and as a nation that they had done that were wrong. The second was it helped them, they felt, and I think there's a biblical precedent for this, that it helped develop self-control. I mostly focus on that part about it being a symbol of mourning. A lot of the Pharisees really took this symbol of mourning seriously. Even to the point of putting white makeup on their faces so that they looked like they were just grief-stricken and weren't eating anymore, and they were really pale. And they would wear old, torn clothes on the day of fasting, to symbolize you didn't wear your good clothes on those days. You looked like you were upset, that things were wrong. And you know what? As we go through the Gospels, we find that there is a place for fasting. There certainly is a place for mourning for sins. But Jesus comes along and he's challenged, okay, why don't you and your disciples fast? And he says, this isn't the time. There's a time and place for it, but today's not that day. You see, we've just learned about the compassion of God. We've just learned about the forgiveness of God, that God gives us second chances. When God forgives us, do we have to stay in that state of mourning? He brings an example of a wedding. Jewish law specifically said that you did not have to fast. In fact, you should not fast while you're attending a wedding. A wedding can last a whole week. If you were at a wedding, you didn't fast. It was a time of celebration and joy. And Jesus says, do you know what? We've just learned about forgiveness. Shouldn't we have joy if we've been forgiven? Shouldn't we have joy if God has given us a new chance, a second chance? Why stay stuck on mourning? Confession of sin is critical to the Christian life. Absolutely important. We cannot ever forget, but what is the purpose of confessing our sins? Is it to feel bad forever? Or did God come along and the end goal is that we are relieved of our guilt? Do you know what? If all we ever do is ask for forgiveness, we don't receive forgiveness. And Jesus says, we've just learned about forgiveness. We understand forgiveness. God has relieved our sins. Satan is called, in the Bible, an accuser. One who accuses us of our sins, who love us to do nothing but focus on the wrong things we have done and convince us of the fact that God cannot forgive us. Excuse me. We are not to be people focused on our sins. Then Jesus goes on and tells these 2 kind of almost strange stories. One of sewing. If you've got a piece of cloth that has not been pre-shrunk, you attach it to something that has been shrunk, well, that piece of cloth will shrink eventually when you wash it. It'll rip it badly. And then he goes on to talk about the wineskins and says if you pour new wine in that still has to ferment into these old hard leather wineskins, I don't know what you describe it as, but anyways, if they're old and hard and the fermenting process goes on in these hard cases, they'll burst. They'll burst. The fermenting process will break down the leather even further, and it'll break. What's all that about? Those who are coming to ask about fasting were caught up in the Old Testament law. They had to be. They had no choice. That's where they were historically. The Old Testament law is all about sin. The law shows us that we're lawbreakers. Chose me. And all of you are lawbreakers too. Sorry. That's the way it is. I can see that my neighbor is a lawbreaker. I can see that my family are all lawbreakers. I know. We all break the law. That's what sin shows us. It shows us how we sin. We can see sin in ourselves, and we can catch sin in others. And if that's the case, we need a lot of fasting. But Jesus comes to bring something new. The New Testament is all about grace. It is about the forgiveness for sins. It is about a new system. It is easier, I'm going to tell you, to be focused on the old system. It is much easier to spend time looking at people's sin. Some people have trouble getting past their own sin. Can Jesus really love me? Can Jesus forgive me? I have sat down with people who said, I ask for forgiveness, but sometimes I don't feel forgiven. My answer is always, it's not about feelings. But they're focused on their own sins. I have certainly met many people, and I think we've all been guilty of this at some point, who love to focus on other people's sins. We are sin-focused people. We love to watch and condemn and worry about what somebody else is doing. And Jesus comes along, and it's not about the things that we are doing wrong. It's about those key words, forgiveness and second chances. And lives are changed in Jesus. Jesus is at work. Why would we run back to our old guilt? If our lives have been changed, our sin should be forgotten. My reaction, or the reaction that we should have, is key. We can be stuck in the wrong that I do. We can be stuck in the wrong that other people do. And if our eyes are on sin, they are not on Jesus. You ever seen that show, Canada's Worst Drivers? Have you ever seen that? Okay, a few of you know what I'm talking about. It's a show where people get nominated because they're really bad drivers and they have to go back to driving school. And one of the things that they're always doing on that show is they're trying to put up distractions. Because their argument is, if you're looking at a distraction over here or something, you're always going to drive to that. Instead, your eyes should be on where you're going, not on where you don't want to go. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Not just in driving, but in life. Because if our eyes are on sin, that's where we're headed. Earlier, the gentlemen who were doing singing read from Psalm chapter 30, which said, "For his anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning." We need to move on from sin and towards Jesus. If we understand the sinful nature, the fall of creation, the need for the cross, the return of Jesus in judgment, I can either stare at the sins of people, or I can look at Jesus. and say, everybody messed up. Look at those sinners. My reaction is God brings joy into my life. I'm part of that wedding celebration that he's talking about. I've been forgiven. Something new is happening in my life. And because that's happening, I'm not really worried about the sin all around me. I'm worried about Jesus. I'm looking to Jesus. I had to spend the last day and a half at denominational business meetings. Quite often very boring. Part of it was we voted on budgets and things. Usually these meetings end up with all sorts of strategies about how we should do this, we should do that. We had a great ending to our meeting yesterday. He said, we don't need more strategies. We need to have Jesus Christ as the center of our lives. And I thought that was exactly right. Because that's what the church has been really good historically about condemning sin. And sometimes even to the point where we're so focused on sin, we forget about Jesus. We need to love Jesus because joy has come into our lives and it helps focus our eyes. My reaction is this. Joy is a gift of God that comes from glorifying Jesus, that comes from helping others understand that they have second chances. Those things focus my attention on the fact that Jesus is at work. Jesus has given me so much for forgiveness. Isn't the cross something wonderful? If I'm somebody who struggles with the idea, can God really forgive me? Let me ask you this. Do you think the cross is not strong enough? Do you think the forgiveness of God is not strong enough? If you're worried about somebody else's sin, are you really saying that, God can't work in their life? If we spend all our time consumed about somebody else's sin, and I'm worried about it, I'm really saying that God's not strong enough to deal with it. That God's not powerful enough. That God can't do it, so I better worry about it. I'm going to tell you, Jesus Christ is very powerful. The cross is the great instrument that has changed history. It can change lives. It can change my life. We're going to come to this table in a moment to remember how powerful the cross is. A reminder not just of sin, but more importantly of the power that has broken sin. The darkness of sin has been shattered by the light of Jesus Christ. Are you guilty of sin? Are you guilty of sin? If you've been forgiven, the answer is no. The Bible calls it something amazing called justification. That's a fancy biblical word. That you can stand before the judge and be found not guilty because of the work of Jesus Christ. We should fast. That's a biblical prerogative. We should mourn and confess sin. That is critical to understanding how good we have it in Jesus. We should mourn even the sin of our nation. But Jesus comes, and as we learn about forgiveness, that becomes our focus. Sin has caused a real need in our life. We can struggle with it. And sometimes we need to back up a step and come back to forgiveness, come back to second chances. But people sometimes ask me, how come I don't always feel like I'm forgiven? Well, we need to do our reaction. We need to worship, to glorify God. We need to share this second chance that we have with other people, to do the work that Jesus calls us to do. And when we're like that, when that's happening, God will pull out joy. God will pull out joy, And my reaction is to look more and more at Jesus, because joy is being pulled out. We come to this table to remind us that sin is defeated, that darkness is being flooded with light, and that life, eternal life, wins.